today. And what I would like to start with is talk a little bit about the genesis of the book, what led to writing the book in its present form. When I retired from the World Bank and IFC, I took employment at the Embassy of Mauritius for 3 years, at the end of which I thought about what to write. I started with a screenplay, actually, on a completely different subject. The screenplay was an environmental thriller based in the Amazon. And I quickly found out when I pitched the screenplay, the completed screenplay actually, to Hollywood, that Hollywood favors the young, the very young.
Can you all hear? I think we're having more trouble hearing this.
So maybe
favorites, what?
You can aim a little more towards us. It's only 2 people.
oh, that's okay. Yeah, okay. Then this, yeah, like this. Do they see me well now?
Yes.
Yeah. So when I realized that the screenplay would not be optioned, and even if a screenplay is optioned, it may not be produced. And a movie may be produced, but never hit the screen. There are tons of movies that are lying there in cans in Hollywood. So I took stock of my life and thought I'll start with a memoir, which would enable me not only to reflect on the defining moments of my life, but also equally important, it would enable me to put Mauritius, where I come from, on the American literary map. The reason being that when I arrived in this country and over the years, whenever people asked me where you are from, I would say Mauritius, and they would either confuse it with Mauritania, or they would think it's in Africa, somewhere on the continent, or it's in India. The usual reaction was, is it in India or in Pakistan? Because I look like I am from the subcontinent. So maybe that's the time to introduce myself. I am of Indian descent. My ancestors left India in 1853. Like 65% of the population of Mauritius is of Indian origin. 25% is of African origin, but mostly mixed with French blood. And the remainder are Chinese and French. And that multicultural nature of the country, the multilingual aspects of the country are reflected in the novel. You will find in the novel, for instance, a poem in French. I also use the Creole language there, but I do it in such a way that it should be obvious from the context what we are talking about. And you will also come across Hindi words because Oriental languages are spoken as well. So I think that's the genesis of the book. What do I deal with? What are the themes I deal with? When I started, I did not have specific themes to write about. If you read, for instance, the New York Times review, or many of the reviews, they mention colonialism, they mention migration, they talk about, themes that kind of resonate with today's issues. But, when I started the book, I wasn't thinking of the issues of the day. And that's what some of the critics of the book have not realized. I deal with the period 1949 to, I would say, 1972. So some have characterized the novel as historical fiction. It is partly that. But the goal was to write literary fiction. that is fiction that also pays attention to language, to the way things are expressed. You will find, for instance, poems in the book as well, which is unusual for many readers, but I don't find it unusual at all. For me, poetry and prose are tools in the literary toolbox. I use poetry when I want to express heightened emotion. I use poetry when I want to express in concise form events that may have taken place over a longer period. So I started by writing a story. The goal is to write something that is interesting, that delights the reader, but at the same time instructs the reader. So if you're writing you're taking stock of your life, naturally the story will be about family. So it's a story about family, it's a story about the community around the family, and it's a story about the country, since my goal was to, as I said earlier, put Mauritius on the American literary map. Consequently, it is a coming of age story of an individual, the main character, named Vishnu Bhushan. And in parallel, it traces the story of the country as it emerges from the status of being a colony of Britain to being independent in 1968. So then, as I deal with the country, there are some issues I raise. That's when the issues come up, right? And those issues have generally been avoided in sort of Mauritian literature. One is the ethnic riots that took place in the years immediately before independence. All the communities lived together, in harmony until kind of the option of independence was presented. And what happened in Mauritius was that the Indian community, the Hindu community, was pro-independence. I would say largely because of the influence of what was going on in India and what was going on in neighboring Africa.
A little bit louder. I'm
Yeah.
having a little trouble.
So as I said, I just repeat the last bit.
Yeah.
The Hindus favored independence from Britain, whereas the Creoles, the people of African origin, they were not keen at all on independence.
Oh.
Which Americans may find strange, but what happened, there are many issues. One was, there was the fear that was kind of fanned by politicians of the opposition, the fear of Hindu hegemony that was raised. So you had politicians who said, if you get independence, you will be forced to wear the dhoti. The dhoti, which is kind of the loincloth that Gandhi wore. Or your women will be compelled to wear the sari. That's the kind of the political propaganda that was going on. And interestingly, one of the chapters of the book, which is entitled Tamasha, deals with that period of Mauritian history, but also what happens to the protagonist, Vishnu Bhushan, and his family during that time. And I want to, I come to sort of, I mentioned literary fiction. So the use of metaphor. The dhoti in the book is a metaphor,
The what in the book is a metaphor?
Dhoti. The dhoti, the Indian cloth, the dhoti is a
Dhoti,
metaphor.
that's the way you pronounce it. Okay.
The dhoti, what's interesting with the dhoti is at the end of that chapter, there is a Creole person who defies the Creole community by wearing the dhoti. Yeah.
Oh, okay.
And that actually happened. This guy came home that day, we were at home, and he walks to us And not only he wears the dhoti as he walks on the street, and we lived in a primarily Creole community. We were, we're the only Hindu family there at that time. He defied the community and he wore the dhoti and came to our door and shook hands with my father. No, he didn't. My father offered his hand. He did the namaste, another act of defiance.
Well, right.
On the other hand, the uncle of the protagonist, he refuses to wear the dhoti at his wedding. He flings it on the floor.
Uh-huh.
And so he defies his community by refusing to wear the dhoti. So the dhoti is a metaphor for me of sort of tradition versus modernity.
I'm glad you explained that.
And immediately after the chapter dealing with independence, you have I have a poem entitled Reincarnation, which is based on an actual conversation between my father and my mother, where my mother asked my father, what do you want? How do you want to be dressed when you die? Should it be a dhoti or not? And if you want, I can read that poem to you. And, so
Page 161.
Reincarnation, yeah, is there. So that's so I'm kind of talking about the various themes. Of course, there's a struggle for independence, which goes to colonialism, colonization, the issue of ethnic riots. So I present Mauritius. Mauritius is known in Europe, is very well known. And it is known as a tourist paradise, a high-end tourist paradise. It's not on purpose. The strategy of the government of Mauritius, and I agree with that strategy, was to prevent Mauritius from becoming a country of backpackers. They come, spoil the environment, and don't spend any money. So it was with 1.2 million people. You can't have too many tourists. So now the flip side of that is that with that kind of tourism, the tourist who goes to Mauritius doesn't really mingle with the people. A backpacker would stay in a whole private home with a bed and breakfast. The high-end tourist will stay in a resort and never get out of the resort. So I present the Mauritius that is not the Mauritius, the paradise that is depicted in tourist brochures. It is the Mauritius that is what where people confront their problems every day. They overcome their problems. Now that I use the word overcome problems, the novel is, I would say, being a coming-of-age story. It's an aspirational novel. It's a novel about a character, a protagonist, who surmounts obstacles, and he ends up in America. And the last chapter is kind of devoted to his experiences in the United States. So I think I have.
But you answer a lot of the questions I had.
So I've kind of covered. I mean, I'm sure there are lots of things I've missed, but that will come out in the question time.
All right.
I think the questions, what we'll do is we'll start with the people here, so I don't have to disconnect the mic yet, and then we'll go to the people online.
Okay.
I have a question.
Yes.
The French and the British left considerable influence on the island. Why is there no influence from the Moors who came first and the Dutch who were there for a while?
But
Or is there?
Yeah, first, historically, what happened? Mauritius had no natives.
Heck no.
No natives, no inhabitants. It was spotted first by the Arabs. We call it Moors by the Arabs.
The Moors, yeah.
They did not land on the island. At least there is no record that they landed on the island. The Portuguese Vasco da Gama and so on their way to India. There are Portuguese sailors who also spotted Mauritius, but did not land. The first settlers were the Dutch. The Dutch stayed there, but first there were no natives. They stayed there for 60, 70 years and then left the island. So they left, what they left in Mauritius was sugarcane, which had brought in from Java, and various animals. So what happened to the Dutch was South Africa and Indonesia represented much more interesting colonies. They are bigger, had more resources. What I guess they did not realize at that time was that years later, Mauritius will play an important role in controlling the trade, the route, the sea route to India. So the Dutch left nothing except animals and sugarcane. When the French, sort of history becomes interesting when the French arrive. The French arrive, their main interest was to control India. They were fighting the British in India. They had Pondicherry was in India, and there was alliances made between the British with some Indian princes, the French with some other Indian Maharajas. So to work in the sugarcane plantations, the French brought slaves from Africa. That explains the presence of Africans. They call themselves, and we call them Creoles, which is mixed. The term Criollo is also in Spanish. It's also the language. So in 1810, when the British take over from the French, they agreed to respect French laws, French customs, French traditions, and so on. That explains why today the French culture is very strong. Actually, there is not much of a British cultural influence except through the educational system. The main cultural influences in Mauritius are French and Indian. So in 1810, the British take over, main reason being to control the sea route to India. That helps them, control India. Then when they abolished slavery in 1833, the former enslaved people refused to work for their French masters. Whereupon the French planters asked the British to bring Indian laborers. So the Indians come as indentured laborers. There's a contract signed. Most of them came from
Indian
Bihar.
labor,
Indian labor, that's my analysis.
not African labor.
Well, the enslaved people were African, but the formerly enslaved people, they didn't want to work for their masters anymore because sugarcane is backbreaking. You've seen it in Haiti, in Dominican Republic, and so on. It's cutting sugarcane in the tropical sun is tough work, and they just refuse. Plus there are psychological explanations also. The land was associated with slavery. In fact, later, so the Indians come to work in the sugarcane plantations, officially not as slaves, but I think as far as working conditions were concerned, they were more or less the same. With one major difference, because the British let the Indians keep their traditions, keep their religion, and importantly, keep their names and identity. What many don't realize how important that is. We can trace our ancestry. I know when my ancestor came. I know the ship my ancestor came on. Both on my mother's and father's side. And the Hindus kept, and the Hindus and Muslims, because the population of Mauritius, when I say 65% is of Indian origin, 55% is Hindu, 10% is Muslim. So those two groups kept their religion, their rituals, their culture, their dhoti, their saris, and Whereas the enslaved people had to change that. In fact, they didn't have to change their names. The masters gave their names. And they sort of lost touch with their culture. Now, there's a movement in Mauritius going on, after independence, kind of to reclaim these African roots. But as for the Indian community is concerned, they kept their roots all along. So I don't know whether I address your
What's
question.
the official language?
The official language, you could say, is English, but I don't think there is a document. Yeah, I don't think the Constitution states it. It's English because the English ruled the country from 1810 to 1968, and the language of the administration was English. But once you leave the office, we never spoke English at home. My father was a teacher, a school teacher. He could read and write English fluently. We never spoke English at all. Maybe now,
So what did you speak at home?
Creole. The language that unites everyone is Creole.
Which is a mix of.
In Mauritius, the Creole is a linguistic term. You could, let me, word creates confusion. You could say French is a Creole of Latin. You could say that. That's how French started. Spanish is a Creole of
It's a
Latin.
derivative, okay.
So Creole in Mauritius is primarily French, but French frozen at the sort of 18th, 19th century, with inputs from Arabic, from Hindi, from English, right? That's how Creole developed. Similarly, in Haiti, for instance, it's the same evolution of the language. The Creole language in Haiti started the same way, except that they probably don't have Hindi words. There's a chapter in the novel entitled Tamasha. Tamasha is a Hindi Urdu word, but it's part of the Creole language.
Okay. What is and was the word coolie descriptive or pejorative?
It's a pejorative term. In the novel, one of the characters uses it pejoratively. It is pejorative, but initially probably it was not. But it's when coolie is it's like the N word.
Doesn't it come from the Chinese?
Sorry?
Doesn't it come originally from China? Like the Chinese are called
The
coolies?
last time, so I think it's in America, the term coolie was used for the Chinese who came to work in the railroads. But my memory tells me it's of Indian origin. But once you check in Webster or the Oxford English Dictionary, I'm inclined to think that it's from Hindi, but that in America it was used in connection with the Chinese who worked in the railroads.
But cool in Chinese means bitter. Li is heavy. Li was like strength or power, and so it means like bitter. Bitter and like bitter story. Not
Yeah.
taste.
Well, it's worth looking at whether it's Indian or Chinese.
It's a term you use so much
In
in the book.
But today, let's say what they call the Indo-Mauritians, the Mauritians of Indian origin. They would say, I am a descendant of coolies, but that's a way of saying, I've made it, man. My ancestor came as a coolie, but look what I am today. I think that's the way it is used.
And I think it's in the acknowledgements you say that you refer to Uncle Graham have you always said silent winds, dry seas? And I would like to know, what's the context? Why did Uncle Ram always say that?
Okay. Maybe first I will talk about why I use it as a title and the different levels of meaning, and then we'll come. The part of addressing that will include the answer to your question. Right? My family lived by the sea, and the wind and the sea is a daily presence. And this term, Hawa Band Samundar Sukhari, that's kind of the Hindi word. It's a translation of the what, though my uncle spoke Creole all the time, but you speak Hindi also. Like my mother speaks Creole, but she speaks Bhojpuri and Hindi also. So whenever he would come back at night from the bar, he would be drunk and, facing the sea, when people, not everyone, but many people who are drunk feel a sense of power. So like you feel you are facing the sea and the wind, and you are addressing kind of the god of the wind or the god of the sea, and you're saying, Hawa Ban, meaning stop it, halt to the winds. Hawa Ban. Ban is close. Halt. Stop. You win. You, the sea, get dry. Samundar Sukhari means, you, the sea, get dry. So I translated into silent winds, dry seas, because the proper translation would be much longer. Halt to the winds. And you, the sea, I order you to get dry. That's
What would it be in Creole?
In Creole, in Creole, it would be, let's see, because this is an idiomatic, so you have to be, whether you want a literal one or idiomatic translation. Like, if I were to translate it, say, in French, right? Then I would translate it like silent winds, vent silencieux, vent silencieux, silent winds, dry seas, mer sèche. But in Creole, it would have to be different. Maybe like état la mer, it would be more like, what's the term used when you are addressing someone?
Imperative.
The imperative, yeah, it has to be, the translation has to be imperative. That is, almost like, ferme de la gueule, like shut your mouth kind of thing, that's
Very much like Haitian.
Huh?
Very much like Haitian.
Yeah.
Very much.
It's an imperative. I mean, when the uncle says it, it's an imperative statement. The title is not imperative. The title is kind of descriptive. Why? To convey, in a way, the environment of Mauritius, winds and seas. Also, another metaphor at work here is in a situation where things are normal, the winds would not be silent and the sea would not be dry. The title indicates that there's something not quite functional in that society. It conveys the fact that not everything in Mauritius is ideal.
I'm sorry.
And not everything in Mauritius is ideal.
Oh,
It conveys that there's something dysfunctional, in an area, in a region where the winds are silent and the seas are dry. That is not the normal state of affairs. I wanted to convey that as well, and that picks up on Mark Twain's, the prologue that I have, the quote from Mark Twain, where you have Mark Twain writes that he says, God made Mauritius first, then made heaven kind of after, modeled in Mauritius. And then he adds, however, when you talk to some of the natives, however, will tell you that this is an exaggeration. In Mauritius, you have, it's just a marketing tool. The first part is used as a marketing tool by the tourist industry.
Visit Mauritius.
And by,
there you go.
yeah, the chop up the part about this being an exaggeration.
Does anybody else in the room have questions before I open it up to the Zoomers?
I would like to ask one thing. I would like to understand a little bit what your actual upbringing was like for you in Mauritius as a child growing up. I mean,
Yeah, my upbringing was pretty much that of Vishnu Bhushan in the novel. It's pretty much
That was definitely you. There's no
yeah,
question
pretty
about
much.
that.
Pretty much. I mean, there are events that I've invented. The events that I've invented. There are situations where I have sort of manipulated the chronology, or where I have put sort of stuff that happened over 3-4 different time periods into one period, dramatic compression. But overall, what you read is pretty much the way I was brought up.
So you were the boy who never had to wash dishes or
Yeah,
so.
and by the way, I am the boy or the man that did not wash dishes in the end. That's an invention. In the end, I saw the character washing dishes with other students. I didn't have to do that. I wiggled my way out of that.
You never watched.
But yeah, well, now I do. With Nessa being my wife, I have to.
I don't know. Last
Well,
night-
she zoomed in, so if you.
Oh, she knows. She knows.
Any other questions in-house before we go online? Okay,
Just with reference to that poem Lumiere on page
Oh, Lumiere, yeah.
page 127, the teacher that the boy talks to in the afterwards about the poem
Yeah.
refers to Baudelaire, but it sounds more reminiscent of Rimbaud's Bateau Ivre. And I wondered if you were.
Yeah, I wrote that poem when I was around 15, right? And it had, I kept a lot of the stuff that I did in high school. And that helped me to, remember things, right? So at that time, I was reading a lot of Baudelaire. But we also read Rimbaud, right? And there are parts of the book where I leave things kind of to the reader to figure out. So I am glad you said this from Rimbaud, because I think what the teacher was, the teacher loved Baudelaire. So, he could have said Rimbaud. And I could have put in Rimbaud. I could have put in, any Rimbaud or the other one, Verlaine.
okay, I'm gonna unplug the microphone. I think they'll still, if not, I'm sure they'll let me know. So Sarah, I think you had a question. Am I correct on that?
Yes, I just want to know, before you said the last piece, is this book basically autobiographical?
It started as a memoir, and then over time it changed into fiction, because fiction allowed me to manipulate events, compress various time periods, and invent characters and events as well, and also fuse 4 or 5 personalities into one. So it is, I guess, inspired by actual events, which are, however, transformed through the art of fiction.
Thank you. When did you come to the United States?
When did you come to the United States?
I came to the United States just at the time of the protagonist in 1971.
Of the what? I'm sorry.
In
1971,
1971.
Of the, you said something else.
the time of the protagonist in the book.
Yeah,
Okay, thank you. That's okay.
yeah, 1971 I arrived here. 50 years ago.
Wow.
Yeah, did you study in, we were talking about this.
Madagascar. I spent a year in Madagascar.
For
Well, I
a
did
semester?
in Mauritius. I did up to in Mauritius the school system is British, and by the time you graduate from high school, it's kind of equivalent to the first year of college.
Yeah.
So I got a year's credit for that year, and I got a year's credit for my studies in Madagascar. Yeah, I was at the university.
So you had a year in Madagascar
Yeah,
before you went on. to Yale.
yeah.
So why did you go to the United States instead of France?
Exactly the way you have it in the novel. I mean, you have this chapter which I call the political corruption chapter, called the 6 pounds of fish.
No, but I mean from Madagascar.
Yeah,
Same thing.
from
Yeah,
Madagascar,
yeah.
I did my best to come to the United States. In the normal run of things, the Mauritian students who graduate from high school, 1/3 of them go to the UK, United Kingdom. 1/3 go to France. 1/3 go to India. More or less, it's a rough approximation at that time. The United States was on no one's radar. I never, in my high school years, thought of coming here. The reason I came here was I was denied a scholarship to the UK. I was denied a scholarship to France, just as you see, as you read in the novel. I actually had to give 6 pounds of fish to that minister.
Expensive.
I have, the one minister actually did tear a letter of recommendation in front of me, my father. It's kind of that's why I came here. The reason I came here was because I could get a scholarship from a private university. You name me a college in the United States, I'll tell you I know about it. Because I wrote to them. No, I didn't apply. I wrote because you have to pay application fees. I wrote to them. And what gave me hope was at one point I got a letter from the University of Florida at Gainesville. And they wrote to me, I wish I had kept that letter. The admissions officer said, being a state university, we cannot provide financial aid to a foreign student. However, given your credentials, I'm sure you'll get something. Apply to private universities. So I applied to private universities. There was no internet in those days. So I would go to the American embassy and write down. There was this thick Lovejoy's Guide to Colleges. Right? So I go page by page and look, and that's what I did. So finally, 3 colleges wrote to me, sent me their full application forms. It was Harvard, Brandeis, and Wesleyan. And Wesleyan made me the best offer. Somebody the other day asked me, what do you wish you had known something? Is there something you wish you had known when you applied to American universities? And I said, yes. I wish I had known that they had good universities in California because the weather is nicer there. Another interesting tidbit. I didn't know that the University of Chicago was a very good school. So I didn't think of applying to Chicago. You know why? Because for me, brought up on American movies, Chicago for me was Al Capone.
Yeah.
I said, I don't want to go to a place where everyone has a gun.
Well, it is in a tough neighborhood.
It is in a tough neighborhood,
Yes.
like Colombia.
Yeah, right.
So Colombia is not anymore in a tough neighborhood.
NYU was too. New York University
Yeah.
was also in its day.
Yeah.
Do we have other online questions? Let me wait 1 second. Plug as I plug the mic back in. Okay, I think we should be able to hear you now. Sarah, can you hear us?
Yes,
Do you have any other questions?
no, thank you. I'm sort of halfway through your book on audio. And so it gives me much more of a feeling of listening to someone from Mozambique than it does an American or someone else telling the story for you. But I thank you very much. And I wondered, have you written any other books?
Have you written any other books?
No, that's my first novel, actually. Yeah.
Anybody else online have questions? Please unmute yourself. And I'm not seeing anybody unmuting, so I'm going to guess not. So we'll go back to question. Are there any other questions in the room? Okay, Jackie, I see you have a question. I'll plug the microphone back in so people can hear his answer.
Ready?
Yep, I'm ready.
Do you mind?
Yeah, over the years, I covered various regions and various sectors.
In what?
Various regions in various sectors of the
Oh,
economy.
okay.
So at the IFC, I started in what was then the Capital Markets Department, whose function was to help develop capital markets and financial institutions in what then was called developing countries. So my first project was in Senegal to help set up a mortgage bank that would provide mortgage lending to Senegalese people. Then the following project was a leasing company project to help set up a leasing company in Pakistan. Also financing of small enterprises in Sri Lanka. So I did that for 4 years, in the financial sector. Following that, I moved to the World Bank, where the work involves dealing with the public sector, unlike IFC, which deals with the private sector. So with the World Bank, I worked on the Philippines on restructuring of industries, but again, sort of more policy-oriented work. And I then moved back to IFC and worked on the manufacturing sector in the Middle East. Then back to the financial sector to work on Russia, 1998, 1998 to 2000. Went back to Middle East and North Africa as a manager, and finally I was senior advisor on sort of global, in a global department. So I've covered Africa, Asia, Russia, even Cyprus, in the Caribbean, Trinidad. But the only part of the world I've not really worked is Latin America, because I don't speak Spanish.
How did the war affect your parents?
The war.
World War II.
Oh, World War II. My father never, my mother speaks a lot about World War II. There was rationing, rationing of food and so on.
Yes.
However, my parents fared better than many people who lived in the cities, because they lived in the countryside. In the countryside, people grew their own food. And my mother talks about the inventive ways of how they manage. So they found substitutes and so on. But I think it wasn't in Mauritius was not affected badly. We were affected as far as imports of products from Europe was concerned.
But was there fear?
No. It's so far away. Mauritius is, it was, no. I mean, if you were in India, there was a theater, you are close to the theater of war. Africa, if you were in Ethiopia, yes, the Italians were there. In North Africa, Rommel was there. So Mauritius was never, I don't think we ever were war was around. Mauritians fought in the Second World War. The minister who took my fish, the 6 pounds of fish, he was a pilot in the Royal Air Force. There were the uncle at the beginning of the novel. He was sent to Palestine just before the creation of Israel as part of the British
But
colonial
he enrolled
forces.
in the
British colonial
military
force, yeah.
service.
So Mauritians fought in the First World War. So knowledge of the war was through those veterans who would come back.
Was
and
there
tell
conscription?
stories. Sorry?
Was there conscription?
It was, there was no lottery or anything. It was,
No, I mean, just-
conscription, yeah. But it was, what I've been told was, someone would just knock on your door and say, the adult male has to go. But it was not on a large scale. Like on my father's side, one brother went, On my mother's side, no one. So it was, you could say, it was not done very systematically, but it was done, yeah. Now, there were people who enrolled voluntarily. For instance, and these usually were people who had studied in the United Kingdom or in France and felt that, they owe it. They owe it. They want to defend democracy and they want to defend sort of the free world. So there were those enrolled, but these were people educated overseas or people with links to France, mostly to France. Yeah.
Well, some could have been caught during the invasion. I mean, when the Germans marched into.
Yeah, I mean, there were Mauritians who died
Stuck there.
in the war. The Royal College I referred to, where I went to school, in front, and I make reference to that on Armistice Day and on the 14th of July, there were military parades in front of my school, and there's a statue of the soldiers, the unknown soldier, and so on. So, yeah.
Okay, well, if there are no more questions, I think it's time. It is 12 o'clock.
You can
So
unplug
thank
it.
you very, very much.
Thank you.
And I
I
did
hope you enjoyed
record
the
this.
book. I hope you enjoyed the book.
I did
Yes.
record this. It'll be up on our website so that, on our YouTube channel, so that others can also,
Great.
members who couldn't zoom in will be able to benefit from this.
Yeah,
So
and
thank you.
earlier somebody mentioned she's reading the audio version.
Uh-huh.
So the audio version is narrated by an Australian actor
Oh,
of
Australia.
Mauritian descent.
Okay. So, Sarah, I'm not sure if you heard that, but
He's a Mauritius person who went to Australia. He immigrated to Australia. Right? I can't hear. Lynn, are you still there?
yes, we're still here. 1 second.
Yeah, and your wife, Nessa, said that it's a very good recording. She likes the. she
Yeah,
thinks the
a lot of
accent
people
is
like the
correct.
audio recording. Yeah.
But what you're saying is that he is the author, or not the author, the man who's reading the book is someone from Mauritius who now lives in Australia.
No, he's an
a
Australian.
descendant of Mauritian parents. His parents,
Okay.
his parents from Mauritius.
Well, he still has an accent. He doesn't speak like an
Yeah.
Australian.
And that's why it sounds different, because he's Australian.
Yeah.
No, it's not an Australian accent.
Yeah, because he's an Australian who is speaking like a Mauritian.
There you go. He's acting Mauritian. There you go.
Yeah, he's acting Mauritian. Exactly.
Okay, well, thank you all very much. I'm going to end this now, and thank you for zooming in. And, I think each time we try this, we'll get a little better at it. Thank you.